Okay, so I've been so lucky I've been asked to talk about documentation. So I'll talk a very little bit about our documentation and how we document our Iris app SDK. And also later you'll see how we built an Iris app, and there I'm sure he will copy paste some stuff from the documentation. And then I'll talk a bit more about our component library and our public components. And that's the public React components package you saw mentioned in the slides before. Yeah, let's just get into that. First of all, for documentation, keep it close to the code, because I don't want to open up a web browser and look at documentation more than I need to. So everywhere where we can, we try to use JSDocs and do good types. And by good types, everything is not just any or string. So for example, for the Iris app manifest, we have, instead of having a JSON file, where we could of course make a schema and that could help you a bit, instead it's a TypeScript file with a type. And that TypeScript type for the Iris app manifest is then commented with JSDocs, so that when I'm adding a thing down, can you see my, no, you can't see my cursor. Okay, so I'm adding something down here. I get an error saying, hey, you're missing the UI visible property on this object. And then I can type out UI visible, and it will also help me say, hey, it's a Boolean, so you can select from true or false. And of course, if there is something that is like this control visibility, then we are not just saying this is a string. This is of course the string literals of the specific strings that you are able to insert here. And each of them will have a JSDoc telling you what they actually mean. On this case, you can also see that this UI editable, that means that this is for custom fields that I think we'll talk about later. But this specific field that I'm creating in your database, this should be editable in the UI in the manager. But if I set it to false, it does not mean that I cannot still interact with it from my app. Yeah. So again, keep it close to the code so they can stay inside of their editor instead of going out to the documentation every time. And it's also easier to keep that up to date, because whenever we do a change, we just have to deploy the new package and they actually get the changes. And if we do a breaking change, they're not able to push a new version of the app until they actually fix the change, and TypeScript will help them and say, hey, you need this thing to be, this is not a recognized property on the object. Yes. The developer hub, just a quick meme, read the docs, no, skim the code snippets. At least a lot of people are like that. We try our best to do a lot of code snippets in our documentation. Yeah. I'll show first of all just our developer hub. We're working on a new one, developers to Trackunit.com. There will be a very hard password for you, so you cannot enter it right now, but soon it will be public. And we have this just a site. So all of the stuff that we are coming to and we are working on. But when you get in and the Iris app SDK is ready, you will get to the documentation for the Iris app SDK. And here we do our best to make it easy for you. So we use NX as a base for a lot of the stuff we do. So we bind people into using NX Workspace to use our tools. And we really just recommend it a lot because it's easy to understand the structure of extensions and apps when you're using that. So instead of you having to set up your own NX Workspace, you can also just clone our Hello World project and run it in vim install, and then you are up and running and ready to go further. Then you are following our defaults, which are React and all of those things. You can also create your own custom workspace from scratch, and you can set your own settings to NX in that case. Yes, and then again, all of the commands you need to go through, and also some examples of what you should see in the terminal, because if you see something different, then you know what it should have looked like, and then you are probably, it's easier for you to see what's going on. I think when it gets a little more complicated, then for example, like this. So we have again the steps you need. If you want to call our REST API for machines from within an Iris app on extension, then we expose packages for that. So you get a TypeScript API for it. Instead of having to do a fetch yourself, then you get a package where the API is described, and you can just use TypeScript to get through it. And again, then you have the autocomplete and all of that. And this is generated from the Swagger. So that's the backenders who are basically maintaining this. So if the documentation there is not good, then tell the backenders. But for all of these more complicated things in the bottom, let's just have a full app that works. Then you can copy that in, and a full extension in this case that works. You can copy that in and see if it works as expected. And then it's easier to backtrack from there to where you made a mistake or where we broke something in the tools. Yes. We also document our REST APIs in here. That's not really for the Iris app SDK exactly, because we have the packages where you can just use the TypeScript generated APIs. But that's part of the readme.com platform that we use for this documentation. that you get a full generated Swagger. From a Swagger, you get generated this API playground, basically, where you can fill out all the stuff. Try it out. And the README is just a tool where you can do READMEs and documentation, and you get a visual editor. So that's nice for non-developers who we are trying to get to write some of this documentation. And then there's a raw mode for everyone else, where you can just paste in some kind of Markdown, not really their own flavor, as everyone has their own flavor of Markdown. I think that's it about the documentation for the general Iris app and the REST APIs. Just wanted to mention that. Then let's get into UI components. We have a start with that. That's not important. So why do we want to have a public UI component library? And the reason for that is we want other people to develop for the manager. We want to make that easy for them, but we also want it to fit into the platform. So if everybody just chooses a new component library when they are building a third-party application, then every page in the manager at some point will look different. And that's not a good user experience for us. Then you have to, a button is a button, but if it has a different shape or color, then the user will get confused and don't know what a button is anymore. Therefore, we have tried to take all of the most used components in our project, making sure that they are dependent on as few external libraries as possible, making sure they are easy to use. And then we have created a Storybook page here with our UI components. And Storybook is a tool you can use to do stories for React components or other types of UI components, where you can show the component in, that's what we do here. And it's easy for people to get the code for the exact thing. And there is also controls. So if I don't want this indicator to have the unknown type, then I can instead select that this is a success indicator, and now it's green instead. That's the color of the indicator. This is a very basic component, and a lot of our components here are very basic. We don't want them to include a lot of domain-specific things yet. There will be libraries on top of this. So if you need something that are very specific to some machines or something like that, then you're installing that on top, and you can use those components that have these. And in here with all of our components, you have descriptions of each of the properties, and you can play around with it. Then we go down a bit, tell a bit about the usage, and which you can see all the different variants we have of the component. So that if this one is nice, it's pinging and blinking. I want one of those, then it's easy to just show the code and copy it into your application. And yeah, we have the do's and don'ts just to tell people how to use the components. So while this is for third-party developers, it's also very nice to have this internally, because we are more than 60 people working on the same monorepo, and some of us are now located in Canada. So they are working, they go to work right when we are about to leave work. So there is an overlap of 2 hours for all of the meetings and the handovers. So the more documentation we have, they can find themselves, the better. And also it's easier for everyone if you don't have to reach out to people all the time to get an answer. So also for the Storybook, we wanted to keep the documentation close to the code. Let's jump into the indicator component. Can you see this? So all of the text that was next to the properties, that comes from the JSDocs of the props interface for that component. So again, you don't need to open the Storybook to understand what the icon prop does. You just mouse over the icon prop, or when you're using the indicator in your code, then you can also see it there. The big description at the top, where we try to summarize what this component is for and how to use it, how not to use it. That is also JSDocs from in here. So when you're using the indicator somewhere, then you can see all of the information in the code as well. So Mikkel, he mentioned some CSS components, and this is how we're doing that. We look into doing a lot of stuff with Stencil, where you can create a React component and then generate it into a what's it called? Web component, normal web component instead. But because React doesn't play nice with the web components, it would be a lot of hoops we have to jump through. So our other way of doing it is make sure that we have easy CSS classes to use if you want to make something that looks exactly like our components. So first of all, we're using Tailwind. We have our own theme and configuration for that. And then for all of our components, there's an indicator class here, TU indicator. That's the base class for a component. And this is a flex with item center. And then we have a lot of other classes inside of this, where we define all of the different properties for these. This is for the different kinds of them, if it's a primary on X and Y or the different types. So you can just add these classes to any div in your code, and you will get something that looks like it. The cool thing about this is that we get easy to use final classes like down here for the different elements, and we use the BEM standard for our naming. At least we try to follow the BEM standard, so there's some kind of standard. And then we use this Tailwind style components to actually do some logic on it, so it's not just huge class names inside of the elements in the JSX. And behind every one of these colors, for example, you can see here the code tip of what the final CSS for this class actually is. We are using custom properties in CSS for all of the colors. So if we have an app that's very popular, but the maintainer does not exist anymore, we don't have access to the code, whatever, we can still do some updates to some of the things and make sure it still looks like what we're doing in the UI. For the Storybook, we are splitting stuff up a bit. I don't know if any of you are aware of how Storybook normally looks. Normally, it's just one component in the story, and then you have the controls below it, and there is not a lot of extra text and documentation on the page. But the UX and UI team would really like to have some more information, so they could say, hey, don't do this and do this stuff that we cannot enforce in the code, maybe. So the way we're doing this is that all of the pages are actually markdown pages where we import the stories. And you can do this, just have your React code inside of this MDX file. But that doesn't play too well with TypeScript. And when we are doing the stories, we want to make sure that we are actually doing it correctly and we are following the types. And if I change the component and I break the story, I should get an error. So therefore, we have all of the stories in a TypeScript file besides it, where all of the different stories are then located. And of course, it's important to make sure that we say that, hey, these should follow the type of the indicator, and these properties are the ones from the interface to make sure that we get errors when we break stuff. And yeah, we don't, in here you can set the arguments for the args table. We don't do that. Instead, we just also generate them from the TypeScript types. So we're sure when I add a new property to the component, it's also present in the Storybook. I don't have to go in and update documentation if it's just a simple property. Did I forget anything? I don't think so. Probably. I probably forgot something, but I think that's it, unless there is any questions. For the documentation part, so write the documentation. I don't think there is any plans for that right now, but it would be cool. Yeah. So personally, I would like someday the React components to be split out of the mono repo and put in a public Git repo. And then all of the Storybook stuff would then be open sourced and other people would contribute. I think that would be really cool to have that option. Especially when there is, at some point in the future, a lot of third-party developers working on it, and they say, hey, this indicator thing actually needs this support. And again, we might not have time to do it today, then they can commit, suggest the changes instead.